Hello, welcome to bonus episode number 3 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. Now, regular listeners will surely have noticed that the intro music has changed. The outro music has also changed. You're not going to hear it in its precise form today. I'll explain that later. But basically, you know, the previous song I was using called The Fool's Guide, although I think it's one of my best songs, and I liked it as the intro and outro music for the podcast. Maybe I said this before, but I feel that the subject matter, believe what you read, believe what you see, or not, in fact, will be more applicable to the podcast I'm going to do in the future at some point this year, to do with, you know, society and an alternative view, let's say. So you're actually going to hear the new song in full at the end, and how it's going to be used in the future as well. I'll do all that later. Now, before I get to the content of today's show, I got a message from a lady called Teresita in Tenerife. I'm sure there's more than one Teresita in Tenerife, but I'm pretty sure that it's the same one who sent me a message last year. In fact, she was one of the first people, something like episode 2 or 3, I think. But last year her message was, "Your podcast is very well," which I took as "Your podcast is very good." Being an English teacher, I'm very used to that kind of mistake. But I don't know if Teresita has been taking English lessons. She certainly hasn't for me. Or perhaps she's just using Google Translate or something. But her message this year, hopefully there's more than an annual message, but you know what I mean. Her message 1 year later says, "I liked your Colin Hanton interview, and interesting to hear that John was not a fighter, but ran away from Teddy Boys. I wonder what else of his image is not true." You little conspiracy theorist, Teresita. Are you telling me that history doesn't always tell us the truth? I made a slight correction to her English there, but it was pretty good. Yeah, it was interesting. Over the last few years, as I've started to read more, the truth about him not necessarily getting into a lot of fights, and perhaps sort of wounding with his tongue more, as that seems to have been fairly accepted. If you haven't heard my 2-part interview with Colin, the last 2 episodes of the show, he kind of confirmed that. But in Colin's book, Prefab, there was a lot of John Lennon running away. Now, as I said to Colin, I don't blame the guys for running away from Teddy Boys. Some of them, not all of them, were armed with flick knives and chains, and they had razor blades sort of sewn into the lapels of their sort of dandy suits. They were sort of, some of them were violent dandies. Colin said, you know, not all of them even were violent. You know, they got a pretty bad reputation. But I kind of see John Lennon as a caricature of a teddy boy, and there's a very good book called The Day John Met Paul, which is a sort of recreation with as much detail as possible of the 6th of July 1957, the famous Saturday of the St. Peter's Fete, where John and Paul met in that amazing summit meeting that Rod Davis missed because he went to the toilet, or he went home for his tea, depending who you believe. Very good book. I think he's called Jim O'Donnell. He's actually an American, but he obviously spent a lot of time in Liverpool, and he did a good job. And I think, I haven't read that book for years actually, but when I had it, I read it probably 10 times or more. Bit obsessive in those days. And he describes John Lennon not as a rebel, but as a caricature of rebellion. And it's very interesting that I think it's fair to say that John Lennon had sort of identity problems through his life, and perhaps it was only when he met Yoko that he kind of identified himself as an artist. I think he was identified himself as a rocker. I think those 2 things were pretty constant. Way back in episode 2, The Rather Strange Last Day in the Life of John Lennon, I read out basically an essay I did about December the 8th, 1980. That was kind of thing I concluded. That was what was strange about that day, was that he was wearing a leather jacket like a rocker, and he had a sort of 50s haircut. And then he was photographed nude, which you might call artistic. You know, some people could be cynical about that, of course. But going back to what I was saying, the caricature thing kind of works for me, that John Lennon was never quite one thing or another. He sort of dabbled between things, and he had a short attention span, and he had many identities over his life, as we've seen on this podcast and in all the best books about him. And it was interesting that he drew caricatures, you know, cartoons, and it almost seems a parallel. I can't quite explain it exactly, but in my mind it seems to fit. You can't quite commit to being an artist, as in drawing art, not artist in the general sense, which is what he became when he met Yoko. actually going to art college, he never really made an effort. He was more interested in being on the fringes. So caricature is a way of producing art that's not really art in the conventional sense. So you don't have to say, I'm playing the game of being an artist, i.e. a painter or a drawer. I'm sure I probably explained that terribly, but kind of fits in. In short, what I'm saying is he wasn't really one thing or another for a long time. Some might argue for the whole of his life he couldn't quite find an identity, but I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I'd say of his many identities, he was a rocker for, from the sort of mid-50s onwards, and he was an artist in a very general sense from about 67, 68. He was other things. He was a book reader for sure. He had a few things that were consistent in his life, but obviously dabbled a lot. Anyway, thank you for that message, Teresita. So on today's show, so this is, as I said, it's a bonus. I was featured on the podcast, which is actually called Recipe Records, She Said, She Said. And it's run by Lanea Stagg and Jude Sutherland Kessler. And Jude Sutherland Kessler was on my show last year, episodes 11 and 12. We had a great chat about 1964. And Jude contacted me recently through her PR lady, Nicole, to ask if I wanted to be featured on the show. And of course I said yes, very much so. So basically what you're going to hear is some interview questions, and then they play some clips from some of my shows in 2019, which, as I've said before, has been an amazing year. This adventure has been wonderful. Very nice ladies. Did the interview over the phone actually for the first time. In my naivety, I didn't actually know you could ring free numbers in the USA from England. Anyway, I did coach them on the pronunciation of my name, my surname, and also my hometown, Egham. That would have been very impressive if they guessed that, because it reads like Egham, and my surname reads like many things. I was a little bit embarrassed actually by the introduction. They gave me a sort of very lofty introduction, which I'm sure was sincere, but kind of put me on the back foot for a couple of minutes there. But I think it sounds pretty good. What you're also going to hear, one of the clips is my appearance on The Mind Renewed with Julie and Charles, and that was bonus episode 1 a couple of months ago. So I've inserted the song that we're talking about now. It's actually, when we go to the clip during the show, it's not actually explained which song I'm talking about. So basically, you'll hear the snippet of the interview, and then I'll play the full song in the middle of this episode. And then you'll hear me comment on it with Lanea and Jude. So let's get to the interview now, and I'll be back at the end with a few words about the next episode, and also the closing song, as I mentioned earlier. So see you on the other side. Enjoy.
Hello, our She Said friends. Welcome to 2020's very first rockin' episode. I am Lanea Stagg, your co-host of She Said, and the author of the Recipe Records series of rock and roll cookbooks full of good food, good fun, and great rock and roll stories, facts, and trivia.
And I am Jude Sutherland Kessler, Lanea's sidekick here on She Said, and absolutely I love those stories, and I highly recommend these fun cookbooks to you. If you want to start 2020 right, get into that kitchen and rattle pots and pans with Recipe Records. And if you are looking for some true and factual Beatles quote-unquote tales, look no further, because you have got the John Lennon series, which is a highly researched, for 34 years, documented narrative history detailing the life of John. And of course, if you're going to tell his story, you tell the story of his mates, the Beatles, from the day he was born in 1940 up to December of 1980. 4 of the books are already on the market. I ended the last one at the very end of 1964, and I'm now working on 1965. And I want to remind everyone that Volume 4, Should Have Known Better, which tells the hugely, it's the year of Beatlemania. It's the hugely exciting story of the Fab Four, almost day by day, is just about sold out. We have sold out Volume 1, 2, and 3, but we have a few copies of Volume 4 left, so please scurry on over to my website as well, which is, surprisingly enough, johnlennonseries.com, and you'll be able to sign up for our monthly newsletter. We've got lots of interesting articles and updates and coupons and things like that. So Lanea and I are back for 2020 here on She Said once a month, and we are going to bring you some of the greatest people in the world, and certainly our guest today is no exception.
You're absolutely right. And Jude, if your listeners cannot get a physical copy of your book, there are ebooks available. Is that right?
That is right. It is on all ebook formats, from Kindle to Nook to everything in between.
Okay, so make sure that you get your copies today, because it is a long, cold, lonely winter, and these books will bring you lots of warmth. I promise that. So Jude is absolutely right. We are thrilled to be talking today with the founder and host of the highly esteemed podcast, Glass Onion, on John Lennon. He's an English teacher, a musician, a blogger, and a podcaster from Egham, a town in England that he says is so small that some of the people who live there have never heard of it. But he's also lived in Thailand, Laos, Italy, and Spain as well. He's been a Beatles and John Lennon fan for 30 years, which means he became a fan about 4 years after Jude started writing the John Lennon series. And about a year ago, he put his knowledge of John Lennon to work via the Glass Onion podcast, a deep dive into John Lennon's life, music, and the complex psychology of John.
And he's also really one heck of a nice guy. He was so sweet to ask me to be on the show last year. We had such a good time talking together. I thought it was going to go on forever. We could just talk for hours and hours. So Lanea and I are very happy to welcome to our show Mr. Antony Rotuno. Hey, Anthony, thank you for being our first guest of 2020 on She Said.
Hi, Jude. Hi, Lanea. How can I possibly live up to that introduction? You made me nervous now. It's great
you can do it.
Yeah.
You're from Egham. You could do anything.
Yeah, I haven't lived in Egham for a long time, but I made up that joke myself because it's a small town. But it's a long time since I've lived there. I've lived in quite a few places, as you said, since then.
Well, we're so thrilled to have you here, and I want to make sure that people understand that the name of your show is the whole name, the full name is Glass Onion, on John Lennon. It sounds like we're saying Glass Onion on John Lennon, explaining it, but that is the full title. So if you're looking for Antony's show, that's what you want to look for. And I know you're going to want to look for it after you hear what we're going to talk about today, because we're going to take back on a little tour through 2019 via Glass Onion on John Lennon, and we're going to be looking at some of the really incredible guests that you had on the show, Antony, and talking about what you learned and experienced with each one of those people. So let's just start in your own home country, where I understand you're living in. I think when you and I talked, you were living in Spain. But
yeah, that's right, yeah. I don't mean to move around so much. It's just I teach English as a foreign language. That's one of the reasons that I'm able to live in all these places. And I am a bit nomadic, I'll be honest. But I'm in England at the moment, yes.
How many times have you moved, Antony?
How many times have I moved? 4 or 5, maybe?
Okay, well, I've moved 32 times, and I'm getting ready to move number 3, so.
I know, you told me that when you're on my show, I know.
It's nuts, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
how do you feel each time? Do you get used to it, or?
Yeah, you do. After a while, you really start to get an itch to move, because you're like, I can't do this. I can't stay here. So I think you are far from being someone who moves around. I think you're very, very stable, but,
Well, one of the advantages of it, actually, is that I don't accumulate a lot of stuff, because there's almost a whole movement around decluttering nowadays, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, and I can't get into it. I'm full of clutter, but
A few years ago, I had a massive decluttering. I had we call it in England a car boot sale. I think you guys call it a garage sale, garage sale.
Right.
And I made some money from that, and ever since then I've not really accumulated. My only real vices are books and maybe some DVDs, so it's not bad.
Well, my husband is Becky, And I, of course, have a gigantic Beatles collection, so we are clutter plus. But, you know, I hear you. It would be nice, but we're addicted. We really are. Well, it just so happens that the first podcast guest who was on Glass Onion, on John Lennon, is one of my very, very favorite people. It is Liverpool's own David Bedford, who is the author of many books. The first one was Liverpool, the second one, The Fab 104, and then his great book, Finding the Fourth Beatle. And he also made one of the films that I most respect. In fact, he was selected to be our featured artist for Beatles at the Ridge 2 years ago because of the superb work that he did in Looking for Lennon, this great film. And I know that you and Dave chatted a good deal about Pete Best because he's great friends with Pete, and about Dave's insights on Pete's role in the Beatles and Pete's release from the band. So tell us a little bit about what you two talked about, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so David and I met in Liverpool, actually at the Jacaranda, which I'm sure you ladies have heard of, which is the place that the Beatles left from to go to Hamburg in August 1960. And we just had a great time. We bantered from, you know, the first minute that we met. And Pete Best, of course, this whole issue, it's actually had a whole book written about it, a book called Drummed Out, which was written by Spencer Lee, who I think was a DJ in Liverpool. Mm-hmm. And I guess like a couple of camps have emerged, because as you'll know from the Tune In book, you know, Mark Lewison basically, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he kind of said that Pete was very, very limited. And then David kind of has an opposite view, and I heard David talking to Robert Rodriguez, who I'm sure you know as well.
Oh yeah.
And he was he was saying that he played the Decca tape to some drummers who'd never heard of it or never heard the tape before, and they said there was no trouble with Pete's drums. So I don't know. Do you want my opinion on that? Should I?
Sure.
About a week ago, because I knew we were going to talk about this, I sat down with the Decca tapes and I listened to them on headphones and tried to have a completely open mind as if I'd never listened to them before. And I must be honest, like, I find that it's quite repetitive and it doesn't have those dynamic fills that Ringo brought to the band. But, of course, the counter to that is that we only ever heard Pete up to 1962, and unfortunately the Love Me Do, you know, the Love Me Do recording where he starts using that skip beat that doesn't really work. I think he's kind of, a lot of people just judge him on that. And also, what's happened on YouTube, I don't know if you've heard that, but people have started putting Pete's drums to songs like Day in the Life or Come Together, you know, and obviously they don't work, and I think that's a bit cruel. So,
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, David and I, we talked about other things as well. We talked about mostly like pre-fame stuff, and I've started to become more and more interested in the pre-fame Liverpool stuff, I think, because from 63 to 70, there's so much, you know, radio shows, TV shows, that I think the pre-fame years are more fascinating to me now. Yeah. So, yeah, we just had a great talk. He's a lovely guy.
He's wonderful and so knowledgeable, and he really tries to get everything right, you know, and I have a great respect for him. I have an old radio show called the John Lennon Hour, and Pete was on there, and he was nice enough to let me play his version of several Beatles songs, and then we would play Ringo's, and we did them side by side. And, you know, Pete was holding up very, very well, and I think you've made a brilliant point that most people are not taking into consideration, and that is you can't judge someone who did not get a chance to go past 1962. So, you know, that's unfair because look at how the Beatles blossomed and changed and grew in those years afterwards. He did not have that opportunity. So anyway, we're going to listen to a quick clip of your program on Glass Onion with Dave Bedford, and then we'll get your comments on that clip. Anthony, here we go.
Pete Best. All right. Yes. Right, strap yourselves in, everybody. Got a big debate. So there's obviously a lot of quote-unquote revisionism that goes on in different places. One thing, I listened to you talking to Robert Rodriguez, the myth about the Camford taking away his bass drum. Yeah. Just explain that. Because Camford didn't do rock and roll.
No, he didn't. That's it. And this is the lengths to which I go to my research. I got the 100-song set of Bert Camford's songs, right, and listened to them all. Trust me, that is painful. For someone who's a rock and roll fan.
What kind of stuff was it?
It's what they call in Germany, it's called Schlager music. It's light entertainment, it's a big band, so you'd have drums, but it would be more accent on the snare and the cymbals, a little bit of bass to keep everything in time, but it's not a dominant instrument, because your main thing is it's your melody and all the other instruments going on, like an orchestra. So Camphor, doing what he did with Sheridan and the Beatles, that's why he picked an old Scottish folk song, like on and When the Saints Go Marching In, because they were of that ilk that would be known enough in Germany, but it was not Little Richard and Chuck Berry, it was not rock and roll. So at that time, so in June 61, the Beatles have now developed this very hard rock and roll sound. Pete's developed what they call the atom beat, because they had to match shout. They had to get the punters off the Grosse Freiheit into the clubs. So when you see the auditorium where they recorded, and I went there a couple of years ago, it's like a big school gymnasium with a stage and curtains. If you want to record a Scottish folk song with a bit of a funky rhythm like Sheridan did, you do not want a thumping rock and roll bass drum, because you're recording it live. There's no battles, there's nothing to separate the sound. So you'd want it to be quiet. And so Campbell said to Pete, all I want is your snare stuff and a cymbal. Now the rumour about taking the ones that I think came from Tony Sheridan.
Because him and Pete Best, they had a fight.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't like each other, right?
Yeah. So when you're examining evidence for eyewitnesses, you think, okay, why is he the only one who's told this story? Is there history?
So, Antony, what is your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, that's one good example, the Bert Camper issue about taking away the bass drum. You know, I haven't read Tune In for a while, but I think Mark Lewison did have other examples. I think Decker was one of them. I can't remember the details, to be perfectly honest with you, but unfortunately it's a riddle that you're never going to solve, because we didn't hear, like we said, we didn't hear Pete after 62, but, you know, it's interesting. It's constant revisionism. You know, I'm sure you found in your research that things that you thought were definitely true turn out not to be. So I guess it's, do you think these things will ever be solved, or will they just go on forever?
You know, at some point, I think we have to get to the bottom of what really actually happened, and a good example is whether or not Neil Aspinall was in the room when Pete was let go from the Beatles, and of course all of the early documentation, including the book that you mentioned, Drummed Out, very clearly states that he was not, that he was waiting downstairs in NIMS for Pete to come out of the office. Pete himself said he was not in the room. But in recent years, that scholarship has changed, and there is a worry in the study of historiography that people will begin to change history for their own selfish reasons. So I think that's something we have to guard against, is making sure that people don't change it for the sake of inventing new things or coming up with new perspectives, and we stick to the truth. But I don't know. I don't know. You ask a great question. Will we ever get to the bottom of it? I'm not sure. But you also, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, David came up with another idea, which is rather than to think of Pete or Ringo, you can actually think of the Beatles up to 62 with the Pete band, in that it was more basic rock and roll.
Yeah. And
then after 62, you know, they started recording, obviously, and they became more innovative. So you can kind of think of two bands rather than trying to decide between the two drummers. So
I love that. And you can do the same thing with managers. There was that garage band, that leathered, rough band that Alan Williams managed. And then there is that polished, suit-wearing, bow-at-the-waist band that Brian Epstein managed. They're two different bands, you know?
Yeah, they are.
So I love that. Well, you also had one of my very favorite people. In fact, we wanted to have him on our show. We had him penciled in for last October, and somehow we lost touch. And I adore author Philip Kirkland, very knowledgeable author who wrote All Roads Lead to Lennon. And you had him on your program in 2019, so tell us about his new book and anything special that he revealed to you when he was on your program.
Well, yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about this is that it's not necessarily a John Lennon book, because it's more or less the prehistory of John Lennon's family. There are some Beatles stories, for example, the tour to Scotland, and he talks about Julia Lennon. Julia Lennon's probably a character I have an extreme fascination with. Also, I mean, to be honest, I don't know if it's possible to have a crush on a historical figure, but there's something about Julia. I think if I'd ever met her and I was one of John Lennon's friends, I would have been quite taken with her. But yeah, I mean, we had a great talk. We talked a lot about history in general and how, we're kind of given a mainstream view of history, and at school and things like that. And we both said it's a healthy thing to question what you're told. And I love the 19th century history of all the Irish that came to Liverpool after the potato famine. And as far as, there were lots of coincidences. You must have found this in the Beatles story. There's so many coincidences that's why some people think it was almost preordained or something. But I'll just give you one example. Isaac Epstein, who was Brian Epstein's grandfather, and William Pobjoy, who was the grandfather of the William Pobjoy who was John Lennon's headmaster at Quarrybank, they both had shops on the same road, which was Walton Road, Walton. And in 1915, soon after the Lusitania disaster, so during the First World War, there were rumours being put around that both of these men were German. And of course, after the war started, there was almost going to be a witch hunt against anyone who could be proved to be German. And both of these men put adverts in the Liverpool Echo, which were almost exactly the same, trying to find out who'd made the slanderous accusation and offering £50, which was probably a lot of money in those days, to anyone who could find the culprit. So that's either a coincidence in that two men happened to put the same advert, or if they were actually colluding, let's say, colluding is not the right word, but if they knew each other, then it's a coincidence that Brian Epstein's granddad and John Lennon's headmaster's granddad lived on the same road. One of the things I found about Liverpool is that in comparison to London, it seems very small. It seems like everyone knew each other,
Mm-hmm.
So, but there were other things. I can't remember all the coincidences off the top of my head, but I love this book because I'm a bit of a history guy, and it's a kind of book where a John Lennon fan could look at it and say, well, most of this isn't about John Lennon, but my interest in John Lennon will make me interested in history in general. So it's a way of sort of branching away from just Beatles,
Yeah, and I agree. If you think about Alfred Lord Tennyson saying, I'm a part of all I've met, all of those people in that book make John who he is and lead up to, as you said, the Beatles getting together. So it's important, isn't it?
Yeah, and when you read about his grandfather, who's kind of a bit of a Jack the Lad, as we say in England, and then Julia, obviously, I don't have it here, but he described her with some adjectives such as carefree, anti-authoritarian, and when I read them, I'm just thinking that's John Lennon, Yeah. He got that from his mother, and then his father was a bit wayward as well. So you can really see where John Lennon came from, basically. That's what I like.
No doubt about it. Well, as a treat for our listeners, here is a quick clip of Philip Kirkland, the author of All Roads Lead to Lennon, and let's see what they have to say.
She was pregnant. Basically, again, given the morals of the time, she wasn't going to keep it, and the Stanley family decided that she wasn't going to keep it. They were going to send her to this home in Mossley Hill.
Salvation Army home, right?
Yeah, it was run by the Salvation Army. It was private and public. People who didn't have money went there. They had to sort of work like slaves just to have the accommodations we looked after, to give birth and so on there, which she did. John was immediately packed off to the aforementioned Uncle Sid and Aunt Madge and Joyce in Maghull, which was well away from the action.
Yeah.
Adoption was arranged ostensibly with a friend. We assume that this was a friend of Julia, somebody called Margaret Pedersen, formerly Margaret Eden. She was married to a Norwegian officer, a naval officer called Pedersen, and they adopted her. John came back. John was never told. The interesting thing comes later because according to Ingrid, or Victoria herself, she was named Victoria and she was called Ingrid when she was adopted. So it turns out that, in fact, Peder was actually the father.
Yeah, amazing. So the adopted father was her dad. So he had an affair with Julia, basically.
Yeah. If we look at the childhood photos of Victoria, or Ingrid, I think we call her Ingrid, she has a blonde, pale look, a sort of stereotypical Norwegian look, so I think it's entirely possible, no?
Right, yeah. Sort of Scandinavian look. So Julia never saw the baby, is that right? And was told that the baby had gone to Norway, but the baby was actually very close by. Was it Crosby?
Yeah, then Crosby.
It's a sort of suburb of Liverpool, yeah.
Very close.
Anthony, I was really honored to be able to read Philip's book before it was released, and I have to say, of all of the books that I have encountered, and some do an excellent job of giving John's family history, but this is the most authoritative. It's very accurate and thorough. What was the thing, if you had to say there was one thing that impressed you the most about Philip's book, what would it have been?
I mean, probably that he's very fact-based. I mean, when I interviewed him, he said, I'm not interested in kind of anything airy-fairy, if you know that term.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because we were talking about the kind of theories that people have about Strawberry Fields, the song and the place, and he was more fact-based. But, I mean, it's well-researched, it's well-written, not judgmental either. And the other thing I liked about it is, if you notice, beginning of each chapter, there's a philosophical quote, and I kind of like that. I'm a bit of a sucker for a bit of philosophy as well. So, yeah, I mean, a great book. And the stuff, I said, the stuff with Julia, I mean, she's such an enigmatic character. You could definitely question her, she's a questionable mother, perhaps, encouraging John to bunk off school, but, he wouldn't have been what he was without her, and it's fascinating to think what she would have done in the 60s,
Yeah.
Isn't it?
I heard a quote lately that, and then we're going to turn it over to Lanea because I know she has some things she wants to ask you, but I heard a quote lately that I thought so applied to her. My nephew said to his mother, "You're a parent instead of a parent." And Julia was a parent. She was definitely a peer first and a parent second, and that definitely made John the person that he became. So,
Yeah, sort of flighty aunt or even a big sister,
Yeah, exactly. All right, Lanea.
Well, Antony, I know that as the author of a book that blends food and music, I am a true music maniac, and I was intrigued to hear that you play in a band. So tell us about the band, if you don't mind, and what instrument do you play, and give us all the details.
Sure. Well, unfortunately, because I left Spain in July, the band, we're not technically together, but at certain, I could go back there, you never know, but the band was called the Backfield Plan, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's actually the name of a song that we covered. I have a friend who I've known from school, and he's written about 150 songs, but he's never really performed them, and I thought they're too good not to be performed, so we started covering his songs, and we named it the Backfield Plan. I was a singer, guitarist. I play a little bit of piano, and I play a little bit of bass, and it was a rock band, more or less. I mean, we had an acoustic version of the band, which was using an instrument called a cajon, which is basically a box where you can get a bass drum and a snare drum sound. And then we had an electric version of the band, and we were very cosmopolitan, because obviously I'm English. We had one other English guy. We had an American. Well, our bass player was from Peru, and our drummer was Cuban. So, yeah, it was a rock band. We had a bit of a country influence. We had a harmonica and a mandolin, and then we had quite a blues influence. So it was quite eclectic.
That's awesome. Did you have, of course, a Beatles influence?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I'll send you some of our music. Beatles and Dylan, I would say. But, yeah, there's a little bit of Pink Floyd occasionally. There's a little bit of Chili Peppers, because the bass player was a big Chili's fan. And there's a little bit of jazz, even, because the Cuban drummer is a jazz drummer. So
that's great.
Beatles, yeah.
That's great. Well, I also remember reading that you were invited to be on Julian Charles's podcast. I think it's called The Mind Renewed.
Mind Renewed, yeah.
And you talk about your band and play some of your music there. So tell us a bit about that cool experience, and then I'd love to play a little interview or a little bit of that interview if we have that for our listeners.
Yeah. Well, I'd been on Julian's show a few times. We originally made contact in 2014, and his show is, I guess, a bit about society, about politics, generally, but it's very eclectic. And I was on his show, and we talked about things like advertising. We did one called Truth Comedy, which was about how comedy can reveal truths using people like Bill Hicks and George Carlin, if you've ever heard of them. They're my favorite stand-up comedians. And then I went to India last year Didn't make it to Rishikesh. I almost got there, but it was the monsoon season. It was absolutely impossible. But just before I went to India, literally about 3 days, Julian contacted me and said, I've just heard your album. Would you like to come on and talk about it? And, you know, these things are always better when they're a surprise. So I went on there and we talked for about an hour and a half. We talked about my latest album, which is called Through Life, and then we talked about my second album, which is Adventures in Retrospect. Something quite weird is that I didn't make my first album till I was 40, and then I made 3 albums in 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was weird. I mean, I just hadn't got the songs down before. I've been playing them live for ages, but Julian and I, you know how, I'm sure you guys get the same, when you talk to someone for a long time or you've talked to them a lot, you just get this lovely rhythm and it's just so effortless, and it was lovely to talk about the songwriting, because another strange thing was that while I was talking, actually ideas about the songs were coming into my head as I was talking. So I wouldn't have thought of some of the things unless he'd been asking me. So it was, yeah, it was really cool.
Sure.
I enjoyed that.
Very inspirational. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to play a little clip from The Mind Renewed.
So much to say about this song. It's probably the biggest production number I've ever done, really. I planned out each verse. If you notice, if anyone listens to the whole song, there's different effects. The voice is different on nearly every verse. The reason it's called Lessons of War, there's a line about, it's a silly line really, teacher smiles and drops another bomb for us all. Obviously it's not to be taken literally that the teacher is dropping the bombs. I suppose in a way it's the idea that we're all supporting war by paying our taxes, and we sort of perhaps do that unquestioningly. War has just been a preoccupation with me, even since I was a child, purely because I've been trying to discover why everybody seems to think it's so normal and it's automatically assumed to be necessary. And it's very interesting you said about the machine thing, because we made a conscious effort. I said to Kessler Jones, my producer, try and find some computer noises. And very interestingly, the sound effects, which we spent a good 2 or 3 hours putting together, some of them are bombs and missiles and helicopters, but other ones are like computers. And I think one of them is something like a photocopier or something. Because you're absolutely right. You know, it's a military-industrial complex. It's the war machine you and I have talked about many, many times.
Absolutely. And you've got loads of effects in there, and you start off with church chimes and birdsong at the same time.
Yeah.
And I just wondered are you linking somehow the state and religion there? Is that what it's about? The capturing of the religious sensibilities for the purposes of the state, you know?
I mean, that sounds very impressive.
Civil religion.
I should just agree with you there, shouldn't I? No, when we were putting the sound effects together, Kessler had a file of 100 sound effects. And the birds tweeting actually came with the sound effect that was called bells. And we just played it, and there's something about a bell that does sound very ominous.
Yeah.
You know? What really happens, rather than me having a specific idea, what I say to Kessler often, he's very much on board with this, try stuff, and then sometimes the meanings come to you as you hear it. You think, well, this is appropriate for this song, and then the meaning comes to you.
Your head this night will never take. And I wanna kill, but not for killing's sake. And I wanna be protected away from all the things that they'll say. And I wanna kill, but I don't wanna take. And I wanna kill, but not for killing's sake. And I wanna be protected away from all the things that they'll say.
Friends have gone up cold and never felt so alone. I'm thinking of the past and all the people I've known. I know it's wrong, but who can draw a line in the sand? Not those who even dare to cross the man in command. Now lay them all down. Your enemy is lying in the frozen ground. You don't know his name and there's no way he knows yours. And nobody remembers what the killing is for.
Okay, so Antony,
Okay.
so do you want to comment?
Yeah, so that was about a song called Lessons of War. And war is a topic that I fascinated, maybe fascinated isn't the right word, fascinated and horrified me for a long time, you know, because we all grow up, don't we, with wars all around us. There's never really been a time when there hasn't been war. So I'm also planning to write a long blog post. I have a blog about Vietnam, and I've been watching documentaries and reading books, so it was nice to do a war song, and it's probably the most crafted song I've ever done, and we used a lot of sound effects, as I talked about there. A lot of artists find this, like you write a song or you write a book or something, and sometimes you read it back or you listen and you think, Oh, I wish I'd said something else, but that song was actually one of the ones that I feel was complete. I felt like it was everything I wanted to say, which is a satisfying, good for a neurotic artist to have that, you know?
That's gorgeous. Well, Anthony, I know that one of the guests who've been on your Glass Onion podcast who really intrigued me was Ken McNabb, who wrote the new book about 1969 called And in the End.
Yep.
So tell us about that book, Anthony, and what was Ken's focus? And does he reveal anything about 1969 that you or us haven't known?
Yeah, well, I mean, effectively it was about the breakup, because as you guys know, the band basically broke up in '69. I mean, okay, they were together in name. They had one recording session on the 3rd of January 1970, with only 3 of them, known as the Threetles, Paul, George, and Ringo. But yeah, Ken's book was basically about the slow dissolution of the band. But, you know, that probably makes it sound a bit depressing, but it wasn't. It was very inspirational, and I actually got him to read the end of the last page of the book, or a couple of the last paragraphs, because he put it so beautifully that, in fact, 1970 was the beginning of, you know, a new era. But the things that surprised me, I don't know if you know this, but you'll know that when the Paul is Dead stuff started happening, Paul went to retreat to his farm in Scotland, and Life magazine followed him, and sure you know this story where Paul threw a bucket of water on them, and then someone took a photo of it, and he said, oh, you know, will you get rid of the photo if I give you a 5-minute interview? And amazingly, he said, I can't remember the exact words, but it's something like, the Beatles thing is over. He actually told Life magazine that, and that was in maybe November or December '69, and that got completely missed.
Wow.
And obviously we know the official story is that, you know, they ended in April 1970 when his McCartney album came out. But that was amazing. And the other thing that was quite amazing that really showed the difference between 1969 and 2019, we did the interview, was that obviously, you know, all this stuff is going on with the Beatles, with business and with music, but they all went on holiday in the summer and were completely, like, incommunicado for, I don't know, 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So all that stuff can just be put on hold for a few weeks, which obviously would never happen now, you know? Nowadays you have to be glued to your phone, it seems like, and you can't be out of contact for 2 hours, let alone, you know, 2 weeks. So I thought that was really interesting. But, I mean, it's a lovely book, and our conversation was strange because we did nearly 4 hours over 3 Skype talks. I mean, Jude said, you know, her and I conversation could have gone on forever. I think that's the most characteristic thing about my podcast, is that we go on tangents all over the place. And I don't know, Ken and I basically went on a journey, you know, over. I think I put out 3.5 hours in the end. I had to edit it a bit, but we did 4 hours altogether. Yeah.
Wow. Well, we're going to play a clip from your podcast, Glass Onion, of your chat with Ken McNabb, the author of And in the End.
John Lennon gave an interview to Ray Coleman, I think, where John was always prone to exaggeration, but he did say during this interview that Apple was losing money. At the rate we're going, we'll be bust in 6 months or something like that. Yeah. That screams headlines all over the world. Beatles in bankruptcy shock. So at that point, there's a guy sitting in the heart of Manhattan called Alan Klein, we touched on earlier, and when he read that headline about Lennon says the Beatles are going bust, he rubbed his pudgy hands in glee and said, gotcha. He came to London in February 1969, had a meeting with John and Yoko. It always has to be John and Yoko, it's never John on his own. And pressed the right buttons, Antony, because he appealed to John's vanity, he appealed to his ego. They did have a lot in common. Klein was an orphan, he'd lost his mother at an early age. John had lost his mother at an early age. Klein was a profanity-spewing hustler, and John liked that, you know. There was no privilege to Klein, and he spoke honestly, and that all appealed to John. But in the background to all this was Lee Eastman, Linda Eastman's father, and John Eastman, her brother. They were showbiz lawyers in America and New York, very successful family business, and they had floated the idea, without it being official in any shape or form, about, you know, maybe we could help out, you know. And And the contrast between the Eastmans and Klein could not have been more different, because the Eastmans reeked of Park Avenue privilege, and Paul is very class conscious, and that appealed to his vanity, and also they're almost family. In a couple of months down the line, the Eastmans would be family. So you have this terrible dichotomy between the two parties.
Antony, I love what you guys were talking about. You want to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of Ken's humour when he said Alan Klein with his pudgy hands, who was rubbing his pudgy hands to get his hands on the Beatles. Yeah, I mean, Ken's got a great sense of humour. I mean, Scotland, generalising a little bit, but people from Glasgow, for example, are a little bit like people from Liverpool. They're just, that humour is just something you grow up with. And, he's just got a great way of describing things, both written and, talking about them. So that was just a great surprise, because Ken had done a couple of interviews, but they'd only been half an hour or so, and I think he was a bit surprised that we went for so long. But the thing is that the reason it went for so long is that we were going month by month, and we'd done an hour and a half, and we'd only got to like May or something, and we thought, well, you can't get to May, go month by month, and then suddenly stop. So we thought, we've got to get to December, and it just went on and on. But it was great. I mean, Ken's a great guy. We've been in contact ever since, and I'll get him back on the show. We'll find a topic if there isn't one already.
I got an Amazon gift card for Christmas, and because of your podcast, I am spending it to buy Ken's book, And in the End. So
there you go.
Thank you very much for turning me on to that great book, which I will definitely need when I get to that section of the John Lennon series, and I can't wait to read it, too. So we are running out of time, and we've only touched on just a few, and I mean a few, of the great guests that you had on your program in 2019. Of course, I was thrilled to be invited on the show around John's birthday, and I know you also talked with someone that I wish we could have explored a little bit more, John and Yoko's assistant during the early 1970s. Dan Richter was on your program. Yeah. You also chatted with one of our favorite people from Beatles at the Ridge, Dr. Kid O'Toole, the music expert who is one of the editors of Beatle Fan magazine. But one guest that I think must have been extremely special for you was your mom, Frances Rotuno. She was on your program and talked about her memories of the 1960s. So tell us, did you learn anything new about your mom or the 60s on that program?
Well, yeah, that was pretty interesting. The basic premise of our show, this will sound absurd for a show that's supposed to be entertaining, but my mum has always told me that for her, living in the suburbs of the 60s, nothing was swinging at all. It was completely boring. There was no swinging 60s. So I guess the premise of our show is to explore normal life. But we found that the kind of, I mean, I know a lot about my mum. We're very close. We've been close for a long time. We went through a lot when I was a bit wild in my 20s, so we've got a strong bond. But we found that we were celebrating ordinary life, and that was our kind of conclusion, that the swinging 60s was fine, but ordinary life's not bad either. And the thing I learned about my mum is that her and her friend used to jive to records in, I think it was her friend's living room or their bedroom. So never knew that about my mum. Yeah. No, it was great. It's nice to make one of your family members slightly famous as well. So a few hundred people have listened to that talk at least. So that's great.
Those historical records are important. I mean, the person who lived the day-to-day life. I was from a very small town in Louisiana, very conservative North Louisiana town, and there was nothing swinging going on in my 60s either, unless you count going out to the swing set and swinging. That was it. That was the full extent of it. So, but that was so brilliant to invite your mom on to give her firsthand details, and I mean, she was giving you insights that nobody else could provide. And Lane and I, of all the guests, and we love all of our guests, but I think, well, I'll speak for myself. The ones that I cherish and really hold in my heart are when we get to talk to people like Ivor Davis, who toured with the Beatles, the only person to go on the whole North American 1964 tour with the Beatles, and with Art Schreiber, who joined a week late because he was covering the Democratic National Convention. But those guys, they have the first-hand knowledge, and to me, that is such a wonderful and rare opportunity.
And speaking of an opportunity, Antony, we want people to have the opportunity to hear Glass Onion, on John Lennon in 2020. So how can they hear your amazing podcast, and how can they follow you on social media?
Okay, well, I host it from SoundCloud, so it's soundcloud.com/glassonionjlpod. And then I'm on most of the platforms that everybody will know: iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean. There's also a Facebook page, and all of those are Glass Onion on John Lennon, as you said. And then the Twitter handle is @Onion Lennon. That's capital O, capital L. And all I can say about my show really is that it's, as you said, it's a deep dive. I mean, really, I find that a lot of the time the tangents are the most fun. You know, I mean, these topics have been talked about a lot, but I find, I like these organic conversations, and they can go off into any territory we want to, so there's no rules. So some of them are a bit long, it must be said, but I keep them to, I don't know, an acceptable length. Is 2 hours an acceptable length? I don't know.
Sure. Well,
no rules.
Those long conversations, they provide a lot of organic thought and material that people are loving, catching, especially on a podcast where you can listen to it when you're sitting there on the bus or whatever. And so it's a terrific opportunity to listen to these amazing stories and conversations about material that most people probably do not know. So thank you so much for being on She Said, Antony, and we wish you all the best for your Glass Onion podcast in the upcoming months. It's been a joy having you here with us to kick off the new year.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the invitation. And I've stockpiled a lot of episodes, so the podcast will keep going. I thought it would have like a natural end. I thought I'd run out of topics, but that may not be the case. It may go on all of this year and beyond. Who knows?
I have a feeling you're going to keep on going.
Yeah, probably.
Thank you so very much that you are back in England and the British band and start rocking the UK.
Yeah, all right. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Antony.
Thank you.
So there you go. Thanks very much to Lanea and Jude for having me on the show and treating me so nicely. I hope you enjoyed the musical interlude in the middle there. That Lessons of War, as I was explaining, is quite an epic. One of the ones that I really feel was a complete statement. Kind of like my Revolution 9 episode of the podcast, episode 25. It's not very often, actually, as I was saying to Jude and Lanea, that an artist, I don't mean that in a lofty way, an artist, but a person creating a piece of art in a general sense feels completely satisfied. I remember watching an interview with Woody Allen, and he famously hates most of his films. And he did this interview where they're playing clips from his films, and he was looking away every time. He said, I can't look at a frame of it, because all I'll do is want to change a bit and start stressing about that. Anyway, let's just talk about the outro song. So you're actually going to hear another complete song. This is a song I recorded in 2017. It's called Life Goes On, and it only actually has 2 lines of lyric, as you'll hear. And once again, a John Lennon influence, the likes of You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, and I Want You, She's So Heavy. I got very into the idea of sustaining a song without needing a lot of lyrics and a lot of variation. Some amazing musicians on this, as well as my contributions. I played acoustic guitar, bass, and I just play the piano at the end. There's Kessler Jones, who's primarily a guitarist. He was a producer of my albums as well. I mentioned him during the clip with Julian. Kessler did the organ on this song. I think there's a glockenspiel at the end as well, if I remember rightly. There's a lady called Ines Faneca, who has her own band called Faneca. They're very good as well, and they're based around Madrid. She did most of the harmonies. We doubled those. There's about 4 or 5 Ineses on there. And then Maria Martin, another musician based in Madrid, she did that fantastic violin that takes over the song at a certain point. She also did the very high harmony that you can hear just at the very end of the song. Ines and Maria are Spanish, by the way. And then finally there's Bruno Ragone, who's from Argentina, and he did the cajon, which I think I was explaining to Lanea and Jude, actually. Primarily used for flamenco, but it's now become a sort of trendy and quite good instrument for playing small acoustic pop rock gigs, if you want to call it that. It's basically a box, and as I said, you get a snare sound and a bass sound, but Bruno's an absolute master of it. And then he's got a tambourine going as well. That's kind of his trademark, cajon and tambourine together, and he gets this very distinctive sound, which is quite difficult when you've only got two sounds to play with and you're basically just banging a box. But anyway, what I was going to explain earlier is that what you're going to hear in the future is the end of this song, Life Goes On, but the instrumental, so with the last vocals cut off. So you're not going to hear that exactly today. You're going to hear the whole song with the vocals. So 2 songs today, not bad. It's another waltz, actually. When you hear the instrumental ending of it from next week, it's actually pretty similar to the Fool's Guide ending. They're both waltzes. And of course that's very Beatley. You know, I did consult the internet to see which Beatles songs were waltzes. And I don't think this is all of them, but for example, you got Taste of Honey, which is obviously not one of their songs, but Babies in Black is a waltz. Some of these may be in 6/8 or 12/8. I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know the difference. But I just see a waltz as anything that goes 1, 2, 3. So Norwegian Wood. There's obviously the Henry the Horse dance is a waltz, part of Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Lucy in the Sky. The verses, anyway, they're a waltz. She's Leaving Home. And the end of the bridge of We Can Work It Out. You know, the life is very short. There's no time for fussing and fighting. Then it goes to waltz, which, as we now know, was George Harrison's idea. I Me Mine as well. Dig a Pony. God, there's loads. So that kind of fits in some way, although someone I played it to actually said it sounded more like Paul McCartney, which could be true, but, you know, this crossover, this podcast between John Lennon and the Beatles, as you may have noticed. So just finally, the next show will be myself and Scott Phipps talking about the Imagine 1988 film. That's surely going to be a 2-part. I haven't started editing it yet, but the file looks horrendously long, so I think we probably did about 3 hours in the end, something like that. I can't remember, but that's going to be fun for you to listen to, because it was definitely fun to record. So I will see you very soon in February, and here is a complete song of Life Goes On. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.